The universe, in its infinite and often deeply ironic wisdom, had decided my living room ceiling needed a water feature. It wasn't a dramatic, movie-style gusher, but a slow, methodical drip, drip, drip that served as a constant, liquid metronome counting down the seconds of my unemployment. Each drop hitting the bottom of the strategically placed Home Depot bucket sounded suspiciously like the word failure. My name is Leo, 42, single, and as of 3 months ago, a former aerospace engineer. I used to spend my days calculating orbital trajectories for multi-million-dollar satellites. I could tell you the precise thrust needed to nudge a hunk of metal the size of a school bus into a stable geosynchronous orbit. Now, I couldn't even convince a single drop of rainwater to fall into a 5-gallon bucket without splashing onto my worn-out hardwood floor. The splash radius was proving to be a surprisingly complex fluid dynamics problem. This particular Tuesday, after a night of listening to my house slowly trying to drown itself, I'd had enough. A real roofing job was out of the question. My severance package was shrinking faster than a snowman in July, and the only interviews I was landing were for jobs that considered proficiency in Microsoft Excel a high-level technical skill. So I resorted to the universal symbol of, "I'll fix it properly later," which is code for, "I'm going to let this problem fester until it's 1,000 times worse." I went to the garage and unearthed the tarp. It wasn't just a tarp. It was the Tarp. A veteran of countless half-finished projects and ill-advised camping trips. It was a faded, ghastly shade of swimming pool blue, with more silver duct tape patches than original material. It was an eyesore of epic proportions. Getting it onto the roof was a battle of wits between me and gravity, as usual, was a cheating scoundrel. I wrestled it up the ladder, my movements possessing all the grace of a tranquilized bear. I spread it over the offending section of shingles, securing it with a few bricks I found by the dead rose bushes. It looked atrocious. It looked like my house had sustained a cheap, vaguely nautical injury. "It's not pretty," I muttered to myself, catching my breath. "But it's keeping the inside of my house from becoming a terrarium. The city should be giving me a grant for promoting indoor biodiversity." I went inside, and for the first time in 48 hours, the dripping stopped. The silence was beautiful. I celebrated with a beer and fell asleep on the couch, dreaming of stable, leak-free orbits. The peace lasted for 3 glorious days. On Friday afternoon, a pristine white sedan with a city government seal on the door pulled up to my curb. It parked with a precision that was both admirable and deeply unsettling. Out stepped a woman who looked like she was born to wield a clipboard. She was in her 50s, with an aggressively neat salt and pepper haircut, sensible shoes, and a beige polo shirt tucked into pants that were creased so sharply they could have been a public menace. She radiated an aura of someone whose only joy in life came from discovering that your hedges were 2 inches taller than regulation. She marched up my walkway, her eyes immediately locking onto the blue monstrosity on my roof. She didn't look at it with disgust, but with a kind of predatory satisfaction. This was the moment she lived for. I opened the door before she could knock. "Can I help you?" "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "I'm Brenda from the Department of Neighborhood Standards. We've received an anonymous complaint regarding a non-compliant temporary roofing apparatus." It took my brain a second to translate. "A what now? You mean the tarp? My roof is leaking." "Sir," she said, her pen already poised over her clipboard like a scalpel. "As per Municipal Code 117B, subsection 4, any temporary sheeting used for emergency repairs must be of a neutral, earth-toned color and cannot be visible from the primary thoroughfare for more than 72 consecutive hours." I stared at her. "You have a rule for tarp colors?" Seriously? Who complained? Was it Janet next door? I glanced at my neighbor's house, where I could just see a curtain twitch. I knew it. She's been mad ever since my beagle, Einstein, looked at her prize-winning petunias with what she called malicious intent. Brenda was immune to my deflection. Her pen began to scratch across a form. Your 72-hour grace period expired this morning at approximately 900 hours. The sheeting is also in violation of the color code. Blue is not an approved earth tone. What am I supposed to do? Get it professionally painted beige? It's a temporary fix until I can afford a roofer. My voice was rising, a fact that seemed to delight her. The city's aesthetic standards are in place to protect property values for all residents, she recited, as if reading from a script. This constitutes a Level 2 violation. I'm issuing a citation. She tore the sheet from her clipboard with a flourish of finality. You have 14 days to remediate the issue and pay the $50 fine. Have a pleasant day. She handed me the slip of paper. $50. It wasn't the money, not really. It was the principle. It was the soul-crushing, bureaucratic absurdity of it all. Fined for a blue tarp. Fined for trying to keep my house from crumbling around me while I searched for a job. I looked at the ticket. I looked at the smug, triumphant set of Brenda's shoulders as she marched back to her sterile white car. I looked up at the ugly blue tarp, a symbol of my current, pathetic predicament. And then something in my laid-off, overeducated, and profoundly bored engineering brain didn't just snap. It vaporized. It went critical. It was replaced by a single, beautiful, and utterly unhinged thought. Oh, you want a permanent, compliant structure, Brenda? Challenge accepted. My anger didn't dissipate. It congealed. It cooled and hardened into a cold, dense lump of pure, unadulterated resolve. For the rest of Friday, I paced my living room, the $50 ticket clutched in my hand like a holy relic. The injustice of it was a symphony of stupidity. Brenda, the anonymous complaint from Janet, the concept of earth-toned tarps. It was all a perfect storm of petty tyranny. A normal person would have cursed for an hour, paid the fine, bought a hideous brown tarp, and moved on. But I wasn't a normal person anymore. I was an engineer with no project. My mind, which was built to solve complex problems involving physics and materials science, had been sitting idle, marinating in daytime television and the existential dread of LinkedIn notifications. Brenda hadn't just given me a fine, she had given me a problem statement. And my brain latched onto it with the desperate strength of a drowning man clinging to a flotation device made of spite. That night my quest began. I didn't go out. I didn't watch a movie. I brewed a pot of coffee so strong it could probably dissolve steel and sat down at my computer. On the screen, I pulled up the official website for the city of Northwood. It was a terrible, clunky GeoCities-era nightmare, but somewhere in its digital guts was my target: the complete municipal code. I downloaded the PDF. It was over 800 pages long, a dense, unreadable brick of legalese that was likely responsible for a significant portion of the region's insomnia cases. I poured a coffee, cracked my knuckles, and dove in. "All right, you bureaucratic beast," I muttered to the screen. "Let's dance." Hours bled into one another. I was no longer a man. I was a legal scholar on a holy quest. I skimmed through sections on property maintenance, waste disposal, and noise ordinances. I learned more than any sane person would ever want to know about fence height regulations and the legal definition of a nuisance shrub. My internal monologue took on the tone of a mad scientist narrating his greatest experiment. I dove into zoning laws, a murky world of setbacks and easements. I waded through building regulations, a swamp of statutes and subsections. I was hunting for the biggest, dumbest alligator in the whole damn swamp. By 3 a.m., my eyes felt like they were full of sand, but I was running on pure adrenaline and caffeine. I was deep in Chapter 7, Zoning and Land Use, a section so mind-numbingly dull it felt like a deliberate act of psychological warfare. I was scrolling, and then I saw it. It was an old, dusty corner of the code, a subsection titled Rooftop Appurtenances. My finger froze on the mouse. The term was beautiful in its vagueness. An appurtenance is just an accessory, a thing attached to a more important thing. The bylaw was clearly written decades ago, probably to regulate things that were becoming common at the time, like massive, ugly HVAC units on commercial buildings or the occasional water tower. It was a linguistic fossil. I read the text, and my heart started to beat faster. It stated, and I quote, "Any permanent, functional, non-signage structure affixed to a rooftop is exempt from the aesthetic and visibility clauses outlined in Code 117B, provided said structure meets all applicable federal and state safety guidelines for its designated purpose and has received the necessary building permits." I read it again, and again. The words practically glowed on the screen. Permanent, functional, exempt from Code 117B. That was Brenda's code. That was the color and visibility clause. This was it. This was the alligator. My mind raced, connecting the dots with the speed of a supercomputer. A permanent, functional structure. What qualified? A giant gargoyle? Probably not functional. A massive satellite dish big enough to communicate with alien life? Maybe. But the permits would be a nightmare. A helipad? I laughed out loud, a short, sharp bark of delirious sound in the quiet of my house. A helipad, on my roof, in the middle of a quiet suburban street. It was the most gloriously over-the-top, needlessly complicated, and technically compliant solution imaginable. Then the laughter stopped. The engineer took over. A helipad is a functional structure. Its entire purpose is function. It does have federal guidelines, a whole library of them from the Federal Aviation Administration. And according to this dusty old bylaw, if I built it to code and got the permits, it would be completely exempt from Brenda's pathetic rules about earth tones. I could paint it neon pink with purple polka dots if I wanted to, and if the FAA didn't object. "Oh my God," I whispered to the empty room. "Brenda, you magnificent idiot. You are not ready for this level of malicious compliance." The next morning, nursing a caffeine and spite hangover, I started making calls. This was the feasibility study. Step 1. Establish if this was merely insane or technically impossible. My first call was to a major local roofing company, Reliable Roofing. "Hi, I have a quick question," I said, trying to sound as normal as possible. "Do you guys do helipad installations on residential roofs?" There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could hear a faint sound of someone munching on a donut. Finally, the guy spoke. "Ooh, is this a prank call?" Click. The line went dead. Okay, not the most auspicious start. My second call was more strategic. I used a burner phone app and called the city planning department, making sure to sound like a harmless eccentric. "Good afternoon," I said to the audibly bored clerk who answered. "I'm doing some research for a screenplay, and I have a purely hypothetical question. If a citizen, a private citizen, wanted to build a private-use helipad on their roof, what kind of permits and processes would that hypothetically entail?" The clerk sighed, a sound that conveyed a lifetime of dealing with the public's nonsense. "Hypothetically," she droned, "you'd need a full structural engineering assessment signed and stamped by a licensed PE. You'd need to file for a major building permit, which would trigger a zoning review. You might need a variance depending on your lot size, and you'd have to follow all FAA advisory circulars for heliport design, markings, and approach paths. You got a helicopter? It's for a friend, I lied smoothly. He's an enthusiast. Right, well, that's the checklist. Good luck with your screenplay. She hung up. I put the phone down, a slow, wide, unhinged grin spreading across my face. She hadn't said no. She hadn't even laughed. She had, in her monotone, bureaucratic way, given me a roadmap, a checklist. And if there is one thing on this green earth that a laid-off aerospace engineer loves more than anything else, it's a checklist for a wildly impractical, borderline maniacal project. The game was on. The path to glorious, rooftop-based revenge was paved with phone calls. Lots of them. My initial high from discovering the loophole quickly slammed into the brick wall of reality. Finding someone to actually build this monument to spite was going to be harder than I thought. My Google search history started to look like the diary of a madman. Residential roof load capacity, cost of steel I-beams, contractors who do insane projects. The first few weeks were a parade of disbelief and condescension. I decided to meet them in person, thinking my earnest, engineering-focused pitch would win them over. I was wrong. The first contractor was a guy named Chad from Prestige Home Solutions. He rolled up in a gleaming white Ford F350 that had clearly never seen a speck of mud. He wore a branded polo shirt, perfectly coiffed hair, and a Bluetooth earpiece that made him look perpetually busy and important. He walked into my living room, gave the leak-stained ceiling a dismissive glance, and sat at my kitchen table with his tablet at the ready. I laid out my plan, complete with my printouts of the municipal code and my preliminary sketches. Chad listened, a small, patronizing smile playing on his lips. When I finished, he chuckled. It was a soft, dismissive sound that made me want to throw my coffee mug at his head. A helipad? That's a new one. Look, champ, I get it. You want something unique. But let's be realistic here. He swiped through his tablet and showed me a gallery of beige and gray roofs. What you need is our Executive Series package. We can get a nice GAF Timberline architectural shingle on there, maybe in a lovely weathered wood or pewter gray. It'll add 10, maybe 15,000 to your resale value. My guys can have it done in 2 days. I don't want shingles, Chad, I said through gritted teeth. I want a structurally reinforced platform capable of supporting a Bell 206 helicopter. Right. Well, our insurance would never cover that. The liability is astronomical, he said, shaking his head with faux sympathy. How about we start with a free, no-obligation quote on the Timberline? I showed him the door. Next up was a man named Sal, an old-timer who had supposedly been building houses in the area since before the roads were paved. He arrived in a dusty, dented pickup truck and had a face that looked like it had been carved from a piece of oak. He smelled of sawdust and righteous indignation. He listened to my pitch in silence, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at my paperwork. He just stared at me, his gaze so intense I felt like he was assessing my home's foundation and my personal moral failings simultaneously. When I finished, he was silent for a full minute. Then he shook his head slowly, a deep sigh rattling his chest. "Son," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm 68 years old. I've built houses on stilts in a swamp. I once put a 2-lane bowling alley in a rich fella's basement. I even built a panic room for a guy who thought the government was trying to steal his thoughts with radio waves." He leaned forward slightly. "What you're asking for ain't building. It's a cry for help. You need a therapist, not a contractor. Call me when you want a new deck." He left without another word. The third guy was the scariest. His name was Ricky, and his business card was printed on flimsy paper and featured a clip-art hammer. He got a wild, greedy glint in his eyes the second I said helipad. "Oh, yeah, we can do that," he said, nodding vigorously. "Helipad. No problem. Gonna be expensive, though. Lot of special materials, you know? And permits. The city guys can be real pains. But I know a guy who knows a guy. For a little extra, I can grease the wheels, get everything pushed right through. He quoted me a number that was roughly the GDP of a small island nation. I knew his type. He was the kind of contractor who would use wood screws instead of lag bolts and tell you it was basically the same thing. He'd build me a death trap out of plywood and paint, and the first time a strong wind blew, my helipad and my entire roof would end up in Janet's prize-winning petunias. I thanked him for his time and immediately blocked his number. I was starting to lose hope. Maybe Sal was right. Maybe this was a cry for help. I was sitting on my porch, drinking a lukewarm beer and staring at the cursed blue tarp, when a final, long-shot appointment pulled up. His truck was even more beat up than Sal's. It was a faded red Ford Ranger from the early 90s, with one mismatched fender and a bed full of what looked like the contents of a scrapyard. The man who climbed out was in his 60s, with a wiry frame, a wild mane of gray hair that defied gravity, and a stained t-shirt that might have once advertised a rock band or a motor oil. He had a manic, brilliant energy in his eyes, the kind you see in inventors and madmen. His business card just said, "Carl, I build stuff." He strode up the walkway and shook my hand with a grip like a vice. "You're Leo? The helipad guy?" I sighed, ready for the lecture or the scam. Look, I know this is going to sound insane, but yes, I'm looking for a quote to reinforce my roof joists and install a private-use H1-rated helipad. Carl didn't blink. He didn't laugh. He just squinted, looking past me and up at the roofline of my house, his head tilted. You got a truss system or conventional framing in that attic. Looks like a standard gable roof. Probably 2x6 rafters, 24 inches on center. Not gonna cut it." He walked around the side of the house, peering up at the structure. "We're gonna need to double up the supports. Probably run some laminated steel I-beams clear across the primary load-bearing walls. We'll have to open up the ceiling to do it. What are you looking to land on it? A little Robinson R22? Or are we talking something beefier, like a Bell 407? It affects the live load calculation and the substrate requirements." I was stunned into silence. He was speaking my language. Load calculation, substrate. He wasn't looking at me like I was crazy. He was looking at my house like it was an engineering problem. You're serious?" I stammered. Carl finally looked at me and grinned, a wide, conspiratorial expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Son, last year I built a fully functional 3/4 scale trebuchet for a guy who wanted to fling watermelons at his ex-wife's new boyfriend's house. Legally, I should add, all on his own property." He gestured vaguely at my roof. "A helipad is just a flat place for a rich guy's flying lawnmower. The paperwork's the hard part. The building is easy." I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, like I had finally found my tribe. I invited him in and spread my documents across the kitchen table. For the next 2 hours, we didn't just talk business. We bonded. We geeked out over structural engineering, lamented the decline of practical skills in modern society, and shared a profound, unspoken disdain for petty bureaucrats. He looked over Brenda's ticket and let out a hearty laugh. He gave me a quote. It was high. It would require me to cash out a significant portion of my 401k. It was a monumentally irresponsible financial decision. "I'll do it," I said without hesitation. Carl's grin returned. He stuck out a calloused hand. "We're gonna build you a helipad the FAA themselves would be proud of." We shook on it. As he was leaving, I walked him to his truck. "Brenda from Neighborhood Standards has no idea what's coming," I said, a feeling of giddy triumph bubbling up inside me. Carl just clapped me on the shoulder. "She's about to get a crash course in advanced load distribution." The day the steel arrived was the day my quiet, suburban street officially became a spectacle. I had warned Janet next door that there would be some construction, vaguely referring to it as a structural roofing upgrade. I felt that was, in the grand scheme of things, technically accurate. She had just sniffed and said, "Well, as long as it's an earth tone." I was sipping my morning coffee when I heard it. The low, guttural roar of a diesel engine, followed by the high-pitched beep, beep, beep of a vehicle backing up. I looked out the window. A massive 50-foot flatbed truck was attempting to navigate our narrow, tree-lined road. On its back were 4 colossal steel I-beams, gleaming in the morning sun like the bones of some slain industrial beast. The truck driver, a man with a magnificent belly and a weary expression, was getting directions from Carl, who was waving his arms with the frantic energy of a castaway flagging down a ship. The truck's attempt to make the turn onto my driveway was a slow-motion disaster. It crushed the corner of Mr. Henderson's lawn across the street. Then, with a sickening crunch of plastic and metal, it completely annihilated Janet's mailbox, the one she had just custom-painted with delicate, prize-winning petunias. That's when the entire neighborhood came out. It was like a fire drill for the terminally curious. People emerged from their homes, coffee mugs in hand, their faces a mixture of confusion and awe. "What in the world is going on?" I heard Janet shriek from her porch. "Is he building a skyscraper?" Kevin, the teenager from 2 doors down who was usually glued to his video games, was staring, his phone out, recording the whole thing. "Whoa," he breathed. "This is epic." The truck driver finally managed to get the beams onto my lawn with the help of a small crane, leaving deep ruts in the grass. He handed me some paperwork, shook his head, and drove off, leaving a trail of baffled homeowners in his wake. My little war with Brenda was no longer a secret. It was now a public exhibition. The next 2 weeks were a symphony of glorious chaos. Carl and his crew of 2 scruffy, surprisingly efficient guys, named Cletus and Dave, descended on my house at 7 every morning. They worked with a kind of focused intensity, their movements fueled by loud, classic rock blasting from a portable radio and an endless supply of gas station coffee. They cut a massive hole in my living room ceiling to hoist the I-beams into the attic. For days, my house was a mess of scaffolding, dust, and exposed wiring. They methodically reinforced every rafter and joist, sistering beams and adding supports until, as Carl proudly declared, "You could park a tank up there if you could get it up." I became the project manager. My days of staring at LinkedIn were replaced by poring over FAA advisory circulars, cross-referencing my plans, and ensuring every single measurement was precise. I was happier than I'd been in years. This was engineering. This was problem-solving. My 401k was transforming into a 10-ton monument to petty revenge, and it was the best money I'd ever spent. Every whine of a power saw was music. Every percussive blow of a hammer was a tiny, satisfying victory against the global army of clipboards. The neighborhood chatter reached a fever pitch. The local Facebook group was apparently on fire with speculation. Was I a drug lord? A reclusive billionaire? A cult leader? Kevin, the teenager, had become my unofficial hype man, telling everyone I was building a launch pad for my private space program. I didn't correct him. About a week into the construction, just as the final layer of reinforced concrete was being poured for the pad itself, Brenda made her return. She parked her pristine white sedan a safe distance away and marched toward my property line, her face a thundercloud of suspicion. She had her clipboard, as always. It was her Excalibur. "Sir," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What is the meaning of this unapproved construction?" I had been waiting for this moment. I wiped the sweat from my brow, picked up my own clipboard, a beautiful, brand-new one I had bought just for this purpose, and walked calmly to meet her. "Good morning, Brenda," I said, my voice dripping with cheerful politeness. "Lovely day for it, isn't it?" "Do not take that tone with me. This "This thing isn't on any building plan I've seen," she sputtered, gesturing wildly at the massive gray slab now covering most of my roof. "Oh, I think you'll find it is," I said, flipping to the first page in my binder. "This is my new rooftop appurtenance. As you can see, it's a permanent, functional structure. All the paperwork was filed with the City Planning Department 3 weeks ago. Permit number 74 IB Alpha, signed and approved by a Mr. Henderson in zoning." I tapped the paper. "It's fully compliant with all municipal codes, including the one you seem to have forgotten about. Chapter 7, Subsection 3, on rooftop appurtenances." Her eyes narrowed. She was flustered. She hadn't anticipated paperwork. She was a foot soldier, used to fighting unarmed civilians. She wasn't prepared for an opponent who had brought his own artillery. "This is an eyesore," she finally managed, falling back on her favorite line of attack. "It is not in keeping with the neighborhood's aesthetic character." "Funny," I said, feigning a thoughtful expression as I scanned my papers. "I can't seem to find the aesthetic character clause anywhere in the municipal code. It must have been omitted. However," I added, turning to a new page, "I did find FAA regulations for non-precision approach path lighting, which I'll be installing next week. Amber lights, 360-degree visibility. For safety, you understand. Wouldn't want to violate federal law." Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She had no response. She had come expecting to find a violation, an easy win. Instead, she found a fortress of meticulous, weaponized compliance. She gave me one last look of pure, unadulterated venom, turned on her heel, and marched back to her car. She didn't slam the door, but the controlled, angry way she closed it was far more satisfying. I watched her drive away, a wide smile spreading across my face. This wasn't just a battle anymore. This was a war, and I was winning. The final week of construction felt like the lead-up to a championship match. Carl's crew worked with a theatrical flair, as if they knew the grand finale was approaching. The last touches were put in place, each one a deliberate, calculated thumb in the eye of the Department of Neighborhood Standards. They installed the perimeter lights, small amber beacons that would switch on at dusk. They mounted a bright orange windsock on a small pole, which immediately began to flutter jauntily in the breeze. The pièce de résistance was the marking. Using special FAA-approved high-visibility paint, we stenciled a massive, crisp white H in the center of the pad. Beneath it, in smaller but still official-looking letters, we added the maximum gross weight limit. It looked so professional, so legitimate. It was almost beautiful. My roof no longer looked like a house. It looked like a miniature airport. And it was glorious. I was in the kitchen making a celebratory pitcher of iced tea for the crew when I saw it. 2 police cruisers and Brenda's familiar white sedan pulling up to my house in a synchronized, intimidating formation. This time the flashing lights were on. This was it. The final boss battle. Brenda emerged from her car like a general leading a charge. She was flanked by 2 police officers, a tall, stern-looking man, and a younger female officer who looked like she was trying very hard not to be amused. Brenda was no longer armed with just a clipboard. She was holding a thick manila folder, which she clutched to her chest like a shield. She had come prepared for a protracted siege. I took a deep breath, grabbed my own binder, now affectionately nicknamed the Book of Revelation, and walked outside to meet them on the front lawn. The whir of power tools on the roof died down as Carl and his crew peered over the edge, eager to watch the show. "Leo Maxwell!" Brenda's voice boomed across the lawn, filled with righteous fury. She had clearly been practicing this speech. "By the authority of the city of Northwood, and in the interest of public safety, I have a legally binding cease and desist order for this monstrosity." She brandished a piece of paper from her folder. A stop work order. I remained calm. I opened my binder. On what grounds, Brenda? On all the grounds, she shot back, her voice quivering with rage. Zoning violations, public nuisance, unsafe structural additions, violation of federal aeronautical codes. It's all in here. She patted her folder triumphantly. All right, let's go one by one, shall we? I said, my voice steady. It was just an engineering review, I told myself. Present the data. Let's start with zoning. I flipped to a tab marked Zoning. As we've previously discussed, the structure is classified as a rooftop appurtenance under Chapter 7 and is therefore exempt from aesthetic clauses. Here is the signed approval from the zoning board confirming its classification. Brenda's face faltered for a fraction of a second. Public nuisance, she countered. I flipped to the next tab. All construction has taken place between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. on weekdays, in accordance with Municipal Noise Ordinance 48C. Here are the signed affidavits from the crew, attesting to our work schedule. The taller police officer shifted his weight, a flicker of interest in his eyes. Unsafe structure. Brenda was getting desperate. This was her trump card. I smiled. This was my favorite part. Brenda, I would never compromise on safety. I turned to the thickest section of my binder. Here is the 120-page structural engineering assessment, complete with load calculations, materials analysis, and stress test projections. It has been signed and stamped by Dr. Eris Thorne, a licensed professional engineer with a Ph.D. from MIT. His report concludes that the roof can now safely support twice the maximum gross weight of a fully fueled Bell 206 L4 Long Ranger helicopter, which, I can assure you, is significant overkill. I handed the summary page to the younger officer. She took it and glanced over it, her eyebrows rising slightly. And finally, I said, savoring the moment, your claim about violating aeronautical codes. I flipped to the final section. I have followed every single FAA advisory circular pertaining to the construction of a private, non-instrument heliport. The markings are to spec, the lighting is to spec, the obstruction clearance is to spec. Here are the copies of my filings with the regional FAA office. I paused for dramatic effect. Oh, and just for fun, and because I knew you'd be watching, I did add one small personal touch. I pointed to the roof. See that little string of numbers painted on the side? The tail number? They all looked up. In small, neat letters, I had painted N0T4U Brenda. A snort escaped from the younger officer. She quickly disguised it as a cough. The taller officer's lips twitched. That, I said to a speechless Brenda, is a joke, not a FAA violation. I confirmed it with a very helpful gentleman in their compliance department. The taller officer finally spoke, his voice a deep, calm baritone. He addressed me, but his words were clearly for Brenda. Sir, do you actually own a helicopter? Not yet, I replied honestly. But this is America, isn't it? A man can dream of vertical takeoff and landing capabilities. The officer turned to Brenda, his expression firm. Ma'am, his permits all look valid. The engineering report is here. I don't think there's anything we can do. He's followed the rules. Brenda stood there, her entire arsenal expended, her grand offensive shattered against my wall of paperwork. She furiously flipped through her own folder, her face turning a blotchy red as she realized there was no loophole, no forgotten clause she could use against me. I hadn't just beaten her, I had used her own beloved rule book to do it. She finally looked up, her eyes burning with the fire of 1,000 thwarted bureaucrats. She crumpled the stop work order slightly in her white-knuckled fist. Without another word, she turned, stalked back to her car, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent rage in her wake. The two officers lingered for a moment. The younger one handed me back the engineer's report. "N0 T4 U-Burnda," she said under her breath, a grin finally breaking free. "That's pretty good." The taller one just gave me a slow, almost imperceptible nod of respect. Then they returned to their cars and drove off, turning off the flashing lights as they rounded the corner. The moment they were gone, a loud cheer erupted from the roof. Carl, Cletus, and Dave were pumping their fists in the air. I looked up at my beautiful, absurd, and fully compliant helipad, and for the first time in a very long time I laughed. It was a deep, genuine, and victorious sound. The dust settled, both literally and figuratively. Carl and his crew finished the last of the cleanup, packed their tools, and I paid them the final installment. Carl gave me a firm handshake and a business card. "If you ever decide to build that trebuchet," he said with a wink, "you know who to call." In the quiet aftermath, the sheer scale of what I had done began to sink in. I was broke. My 401k was a pale imitation of its former self. I was still unemployed, and I was the proud owner of a state-of-the-art, FAA-compliant helipad for which I had absolutely no use. I spent the next evening sitting on my front porch, nursing a well-deserved beer and just looking at it. The setting sun glinted off the crisp white H. The windsock swayed gently. It was the most beautiful, idiotic thing I had ever seen. My neighbors' reactions were a mixed bag. The Hendersons across the street were still mad about their lawn. Janet was giving me a level of silent treatment so intense I could feel it through her walls. But others were impressed. Kevin, the teenager, now referred to me as Heli Leo and gave me a respectful nod whenever he saw me. A few other neighbors had stopped by, ostensibly to ask about the construction, but really to hear the story. My legend was cemented when a local news blog, the kind that reports on city council meetings and lost cats, picked up the story. Someone, I suspect Kevin, had sent them a tip. The headline was magnificent. "Local man fights $50 Tarp fine by building helipad on roof, wins." The article included anonymous quotes from neighbors and a blurry cell phone picture of my roof. It was my 15 minutes of local, petty bureaucracy fighting fame. I sat there on my porch, sipping my beer, and reflected on the journey. Was it a financially responsible decision? Absolutely not. Was it a proportional response to a minor infraction? God, no. It was objectively insane. But every time I imagined the look on Brenda's face when she saw that news article, or the sound of her sputtering rage during our final showdown, I broke into a wide grin. It was worth every single penny. I had taken a problem, analyzed the parameters, and engineered the most elegant, over-the-top solution possible. I hadn't felt this professionally satisfied since my team's last satellite successfully deployed its solar arrays. A few weeks passed. Life settled into a new, stranger normal. I started getting a few more promising calls for job interviews. Apparently, project management of a private heliport installation was an interesting, if baffling, line item on a resume. One late afternoon, I was in my kitchen, trying to make my budget stretch to include both coffee and electricity for the coming week, when I heard a sound. A low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump that was growing steadily louder. It was a familiar sound, but one you rarely hear this close unless you live near a hospital. I went outside. The thumping was much louder now, seeming to come from directly overhead. I looked up. A news helicopter, branded with a local Channel 8 logo, was circling my house. It was flying unusually low. As I watched, it banked steeply, its engine sputtering slightly. My heart leaped into my throat. The helicopter descended, its rotors kicking up a storm of leaves and grass clippings from my lawn. It hovered over my house for a moment. Then, As smoothly and gently as you please, it began to land. On my roof. I stood on my lawn, jaw agape, as the Channel 8 news chopper settled perfectly within the painted lines of my helipad. The rotors spun down, and a side door slid open. A woman with a microphone and a headset leaned out. Hey, you!" she shouted over the winding down engine. "Is this your house? We had a minor fuel line issue and had to set down immediately. Your pad was the only clear spot we saw for miles. You're a lifesaver." My neighbors were pouring out of their houses again, their phones out, filming the unbelievable scene. Janet was on her porch, her face a perfect mask of slack-jawed disbelief. The reporter, a cameraman right behind her, was now climbing down a small ladder onto my roof. "Seriously, thank you," she said, jogging over to the edge. "I'm Sarah Jenkins with Channel 8 News. Can we get an interview with you? The guy who built a helipad in the middle of suburbia and ended up saving the news crew." I just stood there for a second, the wind from the slowing blades whipping through my hair. I looked at the news helicopter parked on my roof. I looked at the news crew scrambling to get a story. I looked over at Janet's house, her petunias trembling in the rotor wash. Then I looked up at Sarah Jenkins, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across my face. My absurd, financially ruinous monument to spite had actually been functional. It had served its purpose. "Of course you can have an interview," I said, my voice clear and confident. "But we'll have to talk about my landing fees first." My mind was already racing, calculating. Because if there was one thing I knew for sure, it was that Brenda and the Department of Neighborhood Standards were about to get a formal proposal for a city use lease agreement. And my consulting fees were going to be absolutely astronomical.